Eurasia Group just released its list of the top risks for 2026, and the list came out on January 5th. But you, along with the rest of the world, woke up on January 3rd to the news that the United States forces went into Venezuela, launched an operation that resulted in the capture of the country's sitting leader, Nicolas Maduro. So to start off the conversation, how much did that incursion impact the list?
Didn't change the list. It did require us to update the news, of course. A couple of quick things. The first is back in 2012, we started talking about a G0 world where the United States was less interested in providing leadership of collective security and free trade and rule of law and promotion of democracy, and that no other country or group of countries would be able to step in. That's structural. Trump has been a symptom of that. He's been a beneficiary. He's certainly been an accelerant, but the process is the same, and that has, sort of really informed a lot of our analysis. More broadly, we knew in December with the National Security Strategy document of the United States that the Donroe Doctrine was a significant component of the prioritization for U.S. foreign policy. And as it was getting harder to focus on tariffs as a U.S. instrument of coercion internationally because of affordability, because the Chinese hit back, because of the upcoming Supreme Court rulings on IEPA, the focus on areas that the U.S. would have more capacity to act unilaterally, the military and the security space, was clearly growing. Plus, Trump had, of course, given Maduro the ultimatum. He was already working within the White House to find ways to remove him from power. It was just a question of what the timing was going to be. So there was no surprise in the order. There was no surprise in Maduro being removed. The success of the military operation, now that certainly was beyond, I think, what people would have expected. It was at the high end of execution capacity. This risk was pretty much written on the Friday when we had the final draft, so much so that we decided to take some of that language and show people what the draft looked like on Friday, even though obviously it had to change for Monday.
The Donroe Doctrine was number 3 on the top risks, and President Trump used the Donroe Doctrine as justification for Operation Absolute Resolve, which was that operation that got Maduro out. And he said, we've superseded the Donroe Doctrine. It's now the Donroe Doctrine. Why is that a top risk? And is the Donroe Doctrine essentially just the Monroe Doctrine on steroids?
It's the Donroe Doctrine with a D in front of it. I think that's the principal thing, and it's very important for Trump that he names things. We see that with the Kennedy Center, for example. Trump, as you know, believes that he is the most consequential, important, and best president ever. And he wants to make sure that people around him say that all the time. So, having a doctrine that reflects his name personally is important to him. And of course, he did. On the one hand, it's narcissism, but on the other hand, he is a marketing genius, right? He built his billions primarily by understanding how to brand things. Putting his names on buildings that he didn't own, but nonetheless reflecting the increased value of his brand, right? So, he does apply that to American power in ways that other American presidents, frankly, have not to the same degree. And you and I may find that unseemly, but it certainly is authentic to who Trump is. Like he didn't become president and suddenly become a different person. Now, leaving that aside, the Donroe Doctrine implies that in America's backyard, as defined by Trump and his administration, the United States will prioritize its interests, particularly in the security space. It is not the limit of American ambitions. It doesn't imply isolationism or withdrawal from the Middle East or from Asia, but that in the United States and the Western Hemisphere, what the Americans say goes. Now, it's a risk in a few ways. First of all, because it's unilateral. The Americans aren't asking allies or adversaries for permission. They're not communicating with them in advance. They're making these decisions unilaterally. Secondly, the United States has vastly more military capacity to implement on that. The Russians are not asking American permission to invade Ukraine. They're just incapable. If the Russians had anywhere near America's execution capability militarily, Zelensky would be in jail or dead, right? And Ukraine would be a very different conversation. Europe would be a very different conversation. The Russians don't have the capacity. The Americans do, and that makes it a risk. But there's also the reality that for most of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, the United States is dominant militarily, but the Chinese are dominant economically. And the U.S. doesn't really have a strategy to displace the Chinese as the dominant economic power in most of the Western Hemisphere. And, you know, that matters. So, I mean, if you're telling the Brazilians, for example, well, you need to change the prison term of the former president, a friend of Trump, the so-called Trump of the tropics, Jair Bolsonaro, 27-year prison term. If you don't do that, we're going to tariff you. And the Brazilians don't change. And the Americans then back down because they realize that they actually need Brazilian coffee at a cheaper cost because Trump is underwater on the economy. And the Brazilians have more economic trade that they're doing with China than they are with the U.S. Well, what are the Americans going to send in the airborne? You know, and the answer is no. And Brazil is the largest economy in South America. So, I mean, there are limits to the Donroe Doctrine, even if they aren't security limits.